Good morning. The headlines, not surprisingly, are about the Prime Minister's session at CII yesterday. Given his focus on the economy right now, the Prime Minister promised that he would get growth back. He promised a series of sweeping reforms, and he talked about the reforms that the government has done in the past. So he talked about GST and about IBC, and about the coal mining reform there. Now the problem with this is, first it's good, it's welcome that he's talking about reforms. But the GST and the IBC was a long time ago. The GST was badly implemented. And the thing about reforms, frankly, is that you need to do them all the time. You can't do them once in a year or once in 2 years and say, I did this. So the Prime Minister needs to keep at it. The good thing is that over the last few weeks, there have been some reform moves. We need to wait to see basically whether they will pan out. To use a pet phrase of the Prime Minister, Jab jago tavi savera, which basically means that, if the Prime Minister has woken up to the need to fix the economy and to do structural reform, that's a good thing. I think his moves on agriculture, we've discussed this before, were well planned. So we have to see how this thing goes, but the important thing is for him to keep the pressure up. The important thing is actually for industry to keep the pressure up. One big problem that we've had in India so far, I think we've had it for God knows how many decades, that every industrialist in the country is wanting to give between 12 and 13 marks out of 10 to every budget, to every government reform, to every government measure. So until industry starts speaking out, I think we're going to have a problem, but let's see, fingers crossed. Hopefully this time something will happen. India has always reformed well in a crisis. We had 91. So this is a crisis that we've never seen before. So maybe something will work out. It's probably coincidence, but the Telecom and Electronics Minister Ravi Shankar Prasad had a press conference yesterday where he unveiled the details of the government's grand plan to get more electronics manufacturing in the country. More mobile phones and electronics. So Mr. Ravi Shankar Prasad gave the details out. It's a very well conceived plan. It has good incentives for industry to relocate to India. Most important, unlike in the past, the scheme is actually WTO compatible. So basically what it does is, instead of giving SOPs for exports, it's given SOPs for all production. So if an Apple produces a phone in India, whether it sells it in India or whether it exports it, it gets a certain 4 to 5% of the value of the phone will be given to Apple or to Samsung or to Xiaomi as an incentive. So because it's for local production, it's WTO compatible. The scheme itself is designed or is basically scaled in such a way that only phones above a certain value will get the incentive. And since India is by and large a low-cost, middle-cost mobile phone market, essentially it means that a large part of the phones will be exported. Keep in mind that mobile phone exports are one of the fastest growing exports globally. In fact, they're a very significant amount in terms of absolute value. There are about 3 or 4 players like Apple, Xiaomi, Vivo, Samsung, which control about 70 to 80% of the market. So India's big thing here is to try and get some of those big players to locate to India. Samsung is already here. We need to get them to expand more. Samsung is right now, as we speak, in the process of completing the building of its unit for display sets in Noida. So that's good news. There's some amount of value addition already happening here. We've got to see what Apple does. The Minister Ravi Shankar Prasad had a very lovely line where he said कि हम चाहते हैं कि दूल्हा भी आए और बाराती भी, which basically meant that not only are we keen that Apple and Samsung come to India, we're keen that their ancillary units, that their whole supply chain also comes here. So the doula being Samsung and Apple, and the baráti being their supply chain. I think the secretary gave a little briefing where he talked about this is exactly what happened many years ago, many decades ago, when India brought in Suzuki as a partner in Maruti, and then it sold the full company to Suzuki. Over a period of time, Suzuki brought more and more of its supply chain to India, and India has now become a big global exporter of small cars. So we are hoping that the same thing happens in mobile phones, but many a slip between the cup and the lip, as they say. So in fact, we have highlighted some of these a few days ago when we wrote an editorial which basically talked about what could go wrong and how the government needed to sort of guard against that. So I think this is good news. Mr. Ravi Shankar Prasad clearly demonstrated that the government can be innovative when it wants to. In fact, a very important statement Mr. Prasad made yesterday was, this is in the context of the Prime Minister talking about Atmanirbhar Bharat And a lot of economists and other people saying that India shouldn't be inward looking, and there's a problem that there's a possibility that we'll become xenophobic and things like that. So Mr. Ravi Shankar Prasad basically said that an Atmanirbhar Bharat didn't mean that India would be just focused inward. It would mean that India would be self-reliant while being globally competitive. Now, that's a tall claim. It requires a lot of reforms for Mr. Prasad and the Prime Minister to make. Reforms that so far have been very slow in coming, but we live in hope. So that is the second big story for today. I think the bad news continues on the corona front. The lead story in the corona package is quite disturbing, because what it tells you is that the Delhi government is actually telling private laboratories to go slow on their testing. So it's called up all the private laboratories. It said that we don't want you to be testing asymptomatic people. We want you to be testing only people who have obvious symptoms of the coronavirus. Now there's several problems here. One is, in any case, since the private lab tests are being paid for by private individuals like you and me, you and I, there's no reason why the government should be telling the private laboratories not to have those tests. But the bigger problem really here is that in the past, some weeks ago, the ICMR said that about 70 to 80% of people in India who had the coronavirus were asymptomatic, which means that they did not display the usual symptoms of fever, breathing difficulty and things like that. Now, if 70 to 80% of the people who have corona are going to be asymptomatic, then surely it makes sense for Delhi, for the country, to be testing more and more asymptomatic people. So why is the government actually telling these private laboratories not to test asymptomatic people? Now that's problematic at many levels. Primarily, to me, it suggests that the Delhi government is not very keen that the tests proceed very fast, because the more tests you have, the more infected people you have. Keep in mind that in the case of Delhi, we found, this is based on information which the Delhi government was submitting to the Delhi High Court. In the case of Delhi, we found that for every 100 tests being carried out, about 20 to 21 people, that's about 20% of people in the new tests were testing positive for corona. So that's a terrifying number. And in this context, the last thing the Delhi government needs to be doing is to be telling laboratories to scale back on their testing. To be fair, it has to be said that the Delhi government's new circulars or the new advisories to the private laboratories is not actually something the Delhi government came up with. This is a central government ICMR directive that try not to test the asymptomatic people to begin with, which it doesn't make any sense. And hopefully, so this is really bad news. This is the first piece of bad news. The second piece of bad news, we have it on our front page. We have an editorial on it. Is really the complete lack of information which seems to be coming out as far as the pandemic is concerned. So, for example, just to give you two instances from the press conference. One reporter asked the health ministry representative, this is based on the media reports of dead bodies piling up in mortuaries, people not being able to get beds in hospitals, lying on the floor while getting treated. So somebody asked the health ministry's joint secretary, whether India was running short of beds. Now he could have given a straight answer saying that this is our estimate of the number of people who will be diseased. This is our estimate of how many beds will be required in the country. Perhaps in certain cities, the big cities like Delhi and Bombay, which are sort of the epicenters of corona. Instead of doing that, the joint secretary just contented himself by saying, we have a model which we have shared with the state governments on how to predict what is the kind of infrastructure they needed. Then there was this lady from ICMR, a scientist from ICMR. So in response to another question, she said, I think India's peak rate, that's the rate at which the infections start actually falling, not slowing down but falling. I think that India's peak rate is very, very far away. Now, at one level, that's reassuring, because it means that the pressure on the hospital beds and infrastructure is a little while away, so the government still have some time to prepare. At another level, it's frightening, because it's telling you that the infection levels in India are going to keep spreading. Yet, this scientist, after having made this point about the peak infection being quite far away, did not choose to tell people what she thought or what the ICMR thought the peak infection levels would be, how much this would mean in terms of cumulative cases in the country. So there's a complete lack of information, and if this is the central government, the state governments are, in very few states do you actually have data in terms of the occupancy of beds, whether they're close to saturation levels or not. Delhi and Bombay, by the way, give out this data. In many cases, you don't have, for example, in the case of Calcutta, you don't have the details of the types of beds which have been reserved for COVID, about how much, what the occupancy levels are. The thing is, if you give out more data, you actually get to know what is the kind of preparation that you need to make. There would be pressure on the government. The private sector would be coming out to talk to the government. Is there something we can do? Exactly what has happened in the case of ventilators, for example. One point that we've highlighted before, and that has come out in a recent ICMR study, is the fact that the contact tracing in India, in major cities, is very, very poor. So contact tracing basically means that if I get corona, how many people did I meet in the last, let's say, 4 or 5 days? So let's say I met 30 people. So then the government actually reaches out to those 30 people, finds out what their symptoms are, puts them, in quarantine, starts testing them to figure out whether, they have actually got the coronavirus, whether they in turn will spread it. So, we found some weeks ago that the Maharashtra government revealed in an internal report, not an external report, in an internal report, tracing had been done for just 53% of those people. The recent ICMR report, it came out over the weekend, put some of those numbers, similar numbers out for, for major parts of the city. It says for Delhi and Mumbai, the contact tracing has been just done for about 8 to 10 people per infected person. Now there is no way that an infected person would have met just 8 to 10 people. So if the government has been able to trace just 10 people or 8 people, that tells you there's a lot of people out there who are just spreading the virus quite rapidly. Against this 8 or 10 number for Delhi, the number for Orissa is about 140 or 150. So it tells you just how much contact tracing can be done and needs to be done. And that is probably why, despite fairly stringent lockdowns across the country for the first 40 to 50 days, the coronavirus managed to spread so fast. The ICMR, the scientists yesterday announced that the ICMR is doing a survey across the country, and that will give us a lot more details about how far the infection has spread. She said the report should be out within a week, so we look forward to that report and talk about that later. Our lead editorial is not about corona, but it's related to corona. It's basically about, you would have read about how the central government has allowed the state governments to borrow more money from the market, but some part of this is conditional. So they can borrow, let's say, 1% of GDP extra, just like that. But if they want to borrow another 1 percentage point of GDP, they need to fulfill some conditions on, for example, land reforms, urban local body reforms, on the power sector, and things like that. Now, a lot of people have criticized this, economists have criticized it, the state governments have criticized it, and everybody has said that this is not exactly the spirit of cooperative federalism. And the conditions are something bodies like the IMF, for example, impose on countries who borrow money from them. So this is not expected of a central government. To some extent, the criticism is justified, and it is argued that the Prime Minister Modi wants to actually beggar the states. Now, to some extent, that is justifiable. It is because, for example, let's say a big ban on alcohol sales, for example, put a big full stop to this revenue of the state government, where a lot of their VAT revenues come from alcohol here. Similarly, we've been seeing over the last few years, and this has got exaggerated a bit recently, we've seen over the last few years that the central government tends to impose a lot of its taxes through the form of cesses. Now, under the constitutional scheme, under the Finance Commission scheme, the cess part of what is collected by the central government does not have to be shared with the state government. So essentially, by putting petroleum taxes, a part of the petroleum taxes, for example, as cesses, this does not get shared with the state government. So some of these moves of the central government are certainly anti-state government. They are anti the spirit of cooperative federalism. But we've made the point that the state governments have, by and large, had a free ride. So if the central government is asking them now to do something, that's not out of place at all. I'll give you an example here. Almost every 10 years, the power sector has a big bailout. So this was done during the UPA period in about 2003, 2004. It was done in the NDA period in 2014. So, a big bailout is given because at the end of the day, what the power sector does is that you do not charge the market price. So because you don't charge the market price, the state electricity boards, their losses pile up. When their losses pile up, they're unable to pay their suppliers, which sometimes are government companies like NTPC, sometimes they are private sector companies like Tata Power. So the SEBs are not able to pay their dues, and basically there's a crisis. So every 10 years, there has been a bailout package. The problem is that every bailout package, like Uday for example, which was done in 2014 by the current government, when Uday was brought out, the government made the states promise that they would do certain reforms. Very few of those reforms happened. Yet the state governments got, they got huge amounts of money from government-owned banks. Similarly, the SEBs owe people like NTPC and, as I said, Tata Power and other power producers 90,000 crore rupees. So the central government, through its financing institution, is giving a 90,000 crore rupees to the SEBs. Now, once again, the point here is that unless the state governments are forced to reform, this is another 90,000 crore rupees down the drain. So essentially, as the newspaper Financial Express is saying, that these conditionalities are perfectly okay. We are right behind them. In fact, if we have a problem, our problem is that these kind of conditionalities are not being applied more stringently to perhaps the central government. So the central government, the tax department, for example, regularly withholds tax refunds of you running to tens of thousands of crores. The NHI, the central PSUs, perhaps even the central government need to be penalized, perhaps taken to courts to repay some of the money which they owe people. So we are all for these conditionalities. We just want them, in fact, to be stricter. The good news, though, from the whole corona crisis, is really the jumps in technology. I mean, and the innovation that people have done. People like me, for example, I'm making this video at home. Now, work from home was something that we never thought was possible. But I think we've shown over the last 2 months, the entire country has shown that work from home is very doable. And we've seen, in the case of, we had a lead story yesterday about how the Maharashtra government was planning these less contact, not contactless, but less contact hospitals where doctors would be able to zoom in onto the monitors of patients, and the patients would be hooked up to these monitors and oximeters and things like that, and they would be able to keep a track on them. So where a lot of doctors and nurses are required to go and see the patients regularly, this would be cut down dramatically. So we need to make sure that these innovations that have taken place are not forgotten. So telemedicine, distance learning, these are all things which should be encouraged. Because there's this is low-hanging fruit, and frankly, the productivity boost for the economy, it can be very large from this year. An interesting story that we have in this context in our EFE section is on the Marico Foundation Awards. So the Marico Foundation Awards are basically Corona-based awards to see who could come out with solutions to the Corona crisis, and they've been pretty good winners. Some of them have been profiled. A small little snippet has been given on their main innovation. So I'll just tell you some of them. So for example, we've seen from hospitals that the PPE kits are of very poor quality. So some of the awards are about making the PPE kits more breathable. There's some UV kits which actually allow you to sterilize and reuse these masks and PPE kits. So that's great news. The important thing is not to forget the lessons of the Corona crisis. So we look forward to more reforms from the Government of India. We look forward to more innovations, and have a great week ahead, what's left of the week. Thank you.